Welcome, folks, to the second of the series of seminars about ownership succession in childcare businesses. For those who attended or didn't attend last week, it was more kind of a general focus. This week's zooms in on the approach of selling a business, of childcare business, to the employees, featuring Ann McSweeney, program director from the ICA Childcare initiative. So I'm Matt Kropp. I'm the co-executive director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. And before we kind of get into it, a few just housekeeping things around the format today. So this is a Zoom webinar. We welcome folks to submit any questions or comments that you have kind of as we go via the Q&A or chat features, which I'll be monitoring as Ann presents. And then when we get to the end, we'll have some time for additional kind of questions and also discussion. And if anyone would like to kind of join and ask the question or have the conversation, verbally versus through text, there should be a raise hand function that you can use in the webinar. So simply raise your hand, and I can click a button, and then you'll be able to come in and ask your question or give your comment and be part of the conversation. With that, I'll pass it on to LuAnn from Let's Grow Kids to do a little additional housekeeping around a few other items.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm LuAnn Benenati. I am the Director of Program Viability Strategies at Let's Grow Kids. And one of our focuses is on helping programs look at their practices around sustainability of their childcare program. So we are really pleased to join Vermont Employee Ownership Center and Matt and the ICA Group to talk about ensuring your legacy through employee ownership. Just some quick housekeeping details. As Matt said, we are happy that this is a real-time online training that has been approved by Northern Lights for professional development hours for those of you who would like them. If you did not have a chance to put your BFIS number in the registration, if you can see Ashley already knew what I was going to say. If you could put it in the chat, we'll make sure that you get credit through Northern Lights for participating in this training. Just one quick note related to that, you're welcome to stay on this training as long as works for you, but for folks who are looking to have professional development hours for this, you will need to stay on for the entire amount of time. So again, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm looking forward to hearing what Ann has to say, and so I'm going to hand it over to Ann McSweeney.
Great, thank you so much, LuAnn and Matt. I'm really excited to be here. Of course, wish I could be with you all in person. This is a great format given our current situation. I think I want to kind of start there just for a moment and just say nothing in this presentation directly addresses the current situation with COVID. I really encourage questions about how COVID is impacting our transitions to employee ownership and exit planning in general. I think that would be a great thing to talk about. It's not in the presentation for the simple reason that, when I created it a week or two ago, I knew things would change rapidly. And I'm not an expert in kind of the specific supports available to you in Vermont, but LuAnn and Matt are available to chime in with some of that information as well. So I can advance my slides. So I'm just going to quickly introduce myself and my organization. I work for a group called the ICA Group. We're a 40-year-old nonprofit business consulting firm. We have staff kind of all over the eastern half of the US. We're about 19 people, but we're headquartered in Northampton, Massachusetts, just south of you all. And our primary work is creating worker co-ops and some other social enterprises that support and benefit workers with the goal of increasing worker voice, wealth, and power. And we have a special focus in the childcare industry. There are 4 of us who work almost full-time on childcare, and we also pull in other members of our team who work in home care and other industries. And we really try to provide kind of full service support to businesses that are considering transitioning to employee ownership, business consulting, access to financing, and then also training and support for the workers who are becoming owners. So that's a little bit about our organization and our team. And then I wanted to take a second to introduce myself and kind of why I do this work. I came to ICA about 3 years ago with a research and communications childcare background, and was really excited and drawn to this work, both kind of for the larger transformative impact that I think so many of us want to see in the childcare industry, but also for the way that it empowers owners and workers to make changes and improve job quality for themselves, not kind of waiting for those giant policy changes that we all kind of know are needed and increase the funding that we hope are going to happen. I think there's something really empowering about the ability to kind of think about this and do this now, and can build the sort of childcare business you want to see and your workers want to work in. So I hope that I can introduce you to some of these concepts and inspire you as well, but just wanted to give you some sense of why I'm here. And now I'm going to ask you to do the same. Matt will be kind of keeping an eye on this, but if you could just introduce yourself, share a little bit about who you are and why you're joining us today, and kind of that top of mind question that you might be coming into our session with that you really hope to get answered. So I'll give just a minute for that. Hi, Ashley and Kathleen. All right. I don't see anything in the chat. I think if you're joining by a phone, it can be hard to watch and type at the same time. So I'll move on, but please feel free to include that information and other questions that you have as we go forward anytime. All right, so here's our agenda for today at kind of a high level. I just want to start off by doing a quick overview. I think some of you might have joined a previous session on exit planning, but a quick overview of just what exit planning is and why we all should do it and care about it. And then really a deep dive on one exit planning option that you might be less familiar with, which is employee ownership. We'll talk about what that is really broadly to start, and then talk about some specific companies that have implemented it, and then what the process looks like to take a business that you own and transition it to employee ownership. And then hopefully we'll have a lot of time left over for questions. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that our mission resonates with you, Annette. That's exciting. All right, so digging into exit planning for childcare. So why are we talking about exit planning? I think there are a couple of really big reasons. One, and a really important one, like so many small business owners across the US, the value of most childcare owners' business is a huge component in your net worth, in the security of your retirement. And planning is really what's going to help you have control over that selling process and ensuring you get the value you're hoping for your business. And that's really important. And that's a big part of what we work with owners about. But something that's kind of unique to childcare is that your small business owners who are also providing this critical public good, both to parents to enable them to go to work, to children, and to workers. And I think, particularly for childcare providers in rural areas and in cities where we know that we have huge problems with childcare access and childcare deserts, I think a lot of owners have concerns about, what happens when I leave and what services will continue to be available to my community. We know that, it's not easy to start up new childcare. They don't just pop up when one goes away. And it can be a real loss to the community. So there's a lot of other kind of values-driven or personal reasons for wanting to plan really carefully what your exit is going to look like in addition to the financial side. And when we work with owners on this transition process, we're really talking a lot about both of those sides of things. So quickly, again, I think that this has been covered, but just to talk briefly about what is exit planning You know, it's similar to having a business plan. It's something that all business owners should have and not all do. But it's really something that we try and encourage, even for people who have, you know, exit a decade or more off, to just start thinking and start getting some ideas down on paper of what your exit plan is going to look like. It has several different components. Some of it is kind of your own personal reflection on your needs, your timeline, things that you want to be talking about with your family, with your financial advisor. There's also plans for the business and what that business is going to look like without you, and who can best fill the gaps that you'll leave behind, a succession plan. And then I think the part that trips people up the most is thinking about valuation and financial projections for the business going forward. And there's a lot of different ways to approach valuation. You can pay people for valuation. You can find organizations that have grant funding to support childcare succession and do some business PA or valuation with you. And there's online calculators that have a wide variety of levels of detail. The right tool for you is, you know, something we probably won't get into today, but there are a lot of different ways to think about that. And I really encourage, even though that's hard, for you to start thinking about the value of your business early, and especially how it compares to your expectations and hopes for retirement. It's not uncommon that we talk to people who, you know, really think their business is worth $1 million or, you know, a large amount of money, and are having a hard conversation late in life about the value of their business. So if you know now that your business is worth $250,000, you want it to be worth $1 million, and you have time to grow it or make other plans, that's, you know, that's an exciting thing. We want to have that information. It empowers us and lets us, you know, make the best possible plan for exiting our business. So that is at a very high level, some of the components that go into exit planning. And please feel free to ask questions during the planning session from both me and Matt, if you have more about that. All right. Yeah, okay, so the next screen, Ashley, let's talk about some things that specifically relate to childcare for exit planning. So one thing that's really important to consider, childcare centers, such a real estate dependent industry. Your center is your business in so many ways. So if you own your center, you want to kind of start thinking about, do you want to sell the business and the center together? Or do you want to be a landlord for a new owner operator? If you don't own your center, you know, what's your relationship with your landlord? Can you facilitate the next owner getting a lease? These are all things that can increase the value of your business if you can provide some assurances and help new owners think about what their long-term stability in that space. Another thing that is not unique to childcare, but I think is a big thing to think about in this industry, childcare is both uniquely rewarding and uniquely challenging. And I think that that can play a big role in what people want out of their exit. So we talk to childcare business owners who have really kind of hard stops. You know, like, my knees can only take 6 months of this is something I've heard, you know, more than once. But then we also talk to owners that just, you know, they find a lot of value in playing a role in their center, and there's just specific things that they don't want to do anymore. They don't want to be the one getting the 5 a.m. call outs and text messages, or they don't want to be, you know, stuck in the office doing all of the administrative work. So really thinking about, you know, a flexible sense of how you want to remove yourself from your business, both financially and operationally, is something I really encourage childcare business owners to think really seriously about. Another key component that is important to think about in childcare is confidentiality. So much of a childcare business is the ability to retain families and retain workers. It can be very scary to let people know that you're thinking about exiting your business, and very sensitive. So sometimes when we're talking to people about worker ownership, other person seems like, oh, so do you want me to go talk to all of my workers about this and ask if they want to do this? And we say, no, wait, please wait. Sometimes that's the right choice, but really we'd like to work with you much longer, figure out how this would work, if this would work, before you have that conversation, so that we can have that conversation the best way possible. And that usually provides a lot of confidence for a lot of owners who are starting to explore this. And we'll talk more about what that process looks like later on. Finally, licensing is just something I want to mention. It varies a lot state by state, but sometimes people who really want to exit their business quickly, realize that the licensing transfer process can be a long one, even in the best of circumstances. I think this is probably even more so true in this current time with COVID and the different burdens placed on our government agencies. So that's not something unique to transitioning to worker ownership, but it's something to definitely keep in mind. And then finally, another reason to just really have a plan in place. I don't need to tell anyone this, but childcare is incredibly reactive to the economy, to workforce participation in other industries. So you really want to have a good sense of what your financial needs are, kind of how long you can wait out downturns, and just give yourself a sense of your own sort of resilience to the ups and downs that we experience in our economy. And I think that, of course, feels, like a big concern right now. So those are a couple of things that I like to call out for childcare workers. I hope that answered your question, Ashley, a little bit. So now I'm going to talk, let me try to advance the slide, about some of the options for exit and for transferring your business. And of course, some childcare businesses do just close their doors and don't transfer on. We're trying to avoid that with the work that we do in planning for exits to employees, exits to communities. But that is one thing to mention. The big divide in the options for transitioning the business after you leave is kind of an external or internal one. You have an external buyer, someone who's coming who is not related to your center, whether they're part of a national chain or an owner-operator who wants to run the center themselves, and they come in, make an offer to purchase your business. They typically, although these things always depend on a lot of factors, often that's going to be your highest return. The highest purchase price is going to come from these external parties. Some of the national regional chains, which are increasingly buying up childcare centers, they have a lot of cash behind them and can make all cash offers if you meet the criteria of their portfolio. Another really common path is an internal transfer. So we talk to a lot of childcare owners who, they want to sell to a director, they want to sell to a daughter or a son. And these are the ways that childcare businesses have been transitioned for, generations in many cases. And I think they're really strong ways and really flexible ways. And so the benefit of that is it's someone and you can really plan out an exit path that works for you both. Some of the challenges, childcare business managers and workers often don't have the financial resources, the credit, or the cash to buy a business. And we hear a lot about people who had hoped for a transition to a son or daughter, and then that child says, no, I've seen how hard this is. I'm not interested in taking this on. So encourage, that's the one exception to the confidentiality rule, is talk to your children who you're hoping to take over this business early and often about whether they want to do that. So, sometimes we're talking to owners who had planned one of these options, had one of these options in mind, and then realized that some of the benefits that they were hoping for, they could achieve better with a sale to employees. Some of the owners we worked with kind of always had this idea in mind that they wanted to transition to a group of their employees. But a sale to employees is just another internal transfer option that's bringing in a broader base of new owners into the business purchase. So let's talk a little bit more now about what that looks like. But let me just check the questions really quickly. Okay, looks like we'll get there. I know I moved kind of fast through that because I didn't want to be too repetitive with last week, but we can talk about more of that later if it's helpful. All right, so let's talk now more specifically about the employee ownership transfer option. So in an employee ownership transfer, what you're essentially turning your business into is a worker cooperative. And the definition of a worker cooperative is that it is a business that is owned and controlled by its employees. So what does that mean? There's kind of three kind of core pillars to what a worker cooperative is. And then within those pillars, there's a lot of flexibility to design a cooperative that meets the specific needs of that business. So the first one is that workers can purchase a membership share to become an owner of the business. And this is really what differentiates this option from, say, a management buyout. If you were to sell to your director and 2 assistant directors, you might have 3 new owners of the business. And in some co-op conversions, you have 3 new owners of the business at the end of the conversion. But the difference here is that what we're looking to see is that all workers have the opportunity to become owners. So they choose to purchase a membership share, and sometimes there are specific eligibility requirements. They have to have worked at the center for a certain number of years, they have to be voted in by other members, they have to take certain trainings. There's different ways that can be structured, but the opportunity to become an owner is what differentiates this from a management buyout or a partnership. The next pillar, worker owners have decision-making votes in the business. What does that mean? Basically, what we do when we are working with a business that is becoming worker-owned is we're sort of disentangling an owner who wears many hats in the business and thinking about it kind of in the same way that big corporations do, your Microsofts, where they have shareholders, they have CEOs, and they have a board. And we're taking a really parallel structure that's really familiar in our economy, but not typical in small childcare businesses, and making the worker owners the shareholders who also have an opportunity to be board members. And then that board member manages the CEO or the director in this case. So it's a really parallel structure to something that's very kind of normal in our economy, but really centering workers and a little bit different for the childcare industry. And again, there's flexibility here as well. If you have a childcare center that has 4 employees, we're not going to create a large governance structure for those 4 employees to work together and figure out how to make decisions. And then if you have a really big childcare center, you might create different committees to engage workers. There's a lot of different ways to set this up based off of the specific needs of your business. So then the final pillar is that worker owners are entitled to a share of the business's profits. And kind of going back to that standard corporation again, in a standard corporation, the number of shares you've purchased of that business determines how much of that business's profits you get. In a worker-owned business, we have sort of a parallel process where the amount of work you put into the business determines how much of the profit you get. So typically, it's determined based off of the hours put into a business. So the end of a year, usually, the business figures out after expenses how much profit it has left over. And then how the members worked in the business. So you might have a member who worked full-time throughout the whole year, and they would get more profit than someone who became a member halfway through the year and was part-time. So it'd be based off of the amount of kind of work or effort that they put into building up the business and contributing to the generation of that profit. So let me double check. That was a big slide with lots of information, so let me double check if there are any questions. Looks like we're good there. So now that we have kind of a general sense of what a worker cooperative is, why? Why do we do this in childcare? Why does my organization have 4 people doing this? So we think it has a lot of benefits for workers and for owners in terms of creating the sort of workplaces, both the sustainability and the exit path for owners and the sort of workplaces we want to see in childcare. So for owners, you know your team, the legacy and values you've instilled in your business, and this can be a great way to really just preserve that service to your community and the workplace that you've built. Oftentimes there's a core group of workers in childcare businesses who've been there with you for a long time. This is a great way to reward them. There's a lot of flexibility kind of in staging out your timeline with your workers and exiting either, relatively quickly or over a long period of time. Okay. And there's some tax incentives. But I think it's important. I think sometimes people hear this and they start thinking that they're gifting their business away. It is a sale. We're helping people figure out how to sell their business to their employees. I think that's important to say. For workers, it's a continuation of their jobs. They have new opportunities to receive kind of wealth and profits from the business and new ways to participate in the business. And we do have studies from across several industries and also talk about some specific examples of childcare businesses that show improved kind of workforce satisfaction and some exciting retention benefits to employee ownership. Why wouldn't you want to do this as your exit option? That's important to talk about too. You might not receive as much money from this path as from, kind of a investor who's speculating that they can generate a lot of profit from your business if they were to own it and operate it themselves. It's not typically the fastest exit pathway. If you are someone who really wants to be out in a month, that's going to be a challenge no matter what way you choose. That's why we encourage planning. But this is not typically the fastest one. And like most sales of small businesses, you're typically not going to receive all of the cash value of your business up front. You're going to have a seller's note for a portion of the business. That tends to be true no matter what path you choose. But here, it's a really important kind of vote of confidence in the business that you're passing something that you think can pay you back to your workers. So it's about everyone kind of sharing risk and having some skin in the game related to that. What are the challenges for workers? So we do a lot of work, and we've set up our process to really limit the financial risk to workers who are taking on ownership of these businesses. And we can talk more about what that looks like later on in the session. But it does require, an intensive period of setting up a new business, learning new skills. We say like at minimum it's about 20 hours of meetings as you're going through that process and setting it up. And then typically, an additional meeting a month above what your workers are already doing to just kind of continue to understand the business and run it going forward. So people have to be committed enough to the organization that sounds like something that's doable. And the business has to be generating enough profits that that extra work in the business is rewarded. So I'm going to move now to talk. I think it's really helpful to talk concretely about businesses that have employed worker ownership. And it's impossible to do that without talking about ChildSpace, which they're really the pioneers of this model. They started as a worker-owned business. So it's a little bit different than what we're talking about today as an exit transition plan for kind of a traditionally owned business. But they've been around since 1989, and they were started because they had a belief that quality jobs would result in quality care. And they've been going for 30 years now and are NACE accredited, highest rated in the quality rating system in Pennsylvania, a Head Start grantee. And they have about 50% of the industry average turnover for their workforce. So they have some really long-term staff members. And they've chosen to do some really interesting things with their business and the communities they want to serve and the way that they want to give parents in their communities voice. And they've also chosen to really invest the profits of their business into extensive staff benefits, paid time off for vacation, sick leave, planning time, health insurance, a really rich benefits package. That's what they've chosen to invest in rather than profit sharing, which is something that other businesses choose to do. So they've been around for a long time. They are a huge source of information and sort of the research on what we're doing, but they are a little bit different than what we're talking about today. So I wanted to also provide a more in-depth look at the Rose Garden, which is a business that was founded and traditionally owned by one woman, Judith Frislin, in 2008. And she went through the process of transitioning her business to worker ownership from 2015, starting 2015 to 2019. So she took a longer, more flexible path with it. And kind of thinking back to the exit planning options we were discussing earlier, Ms. Frislin is an example of someone who kind of initially thought she would pass her business on to her daughter. And her daughter had been working in the center for a long time and didn't feel like she wanted to become the boss of the people that had been her coworkers for several years. So this really felt like the right path for her, for the daughter as well as for Ms. Frislin. So she knew when she started this process that she wanted to be completely out in 2019. That's what ended up happening. And she wanted to be not going into the office every day, kind of as soon as possible, but she found a lot of value in continuing to mentor the teachers and playing an advising role in the business. So that was a big part of her exit planning process. She was relying on the sale of the business to fund her retirement, but she was flexible around seller financing, receiving deferred payments over time, as well as the exact purchase price of the business. So she was able to exit the business without the business hiring a new director, and that is kind of a unique case. Many times we are not able to do that, and a new director needs to be hired. But her assistant director stepped into being the director, and she trained her staff in a lot of the different things, the marketing and kind of parent engagement and payroll work that she was doing. And because of that, the business was able to be more profitable because people were willing to step up into those roles. That isn't necessary for this to work, but it certainly is helpful in assuring that this path forward can work. Let's move on a little bit. So she worked with our organization as well as a local cooperative development organization in Buffalo, just kind of right across the lake from you all, I think. And out of 7 employees, 5 became worker owners. There was one who was approaching retirement and just didn't feel like it made sense for her to join. And there was another employee who wasn't eligible. She had just started working and didn't meet the eligibility requirement at that time. So 5 out of 7. It's also the case that sometimes people just decide they don't want to be worker owners. In this case, everyone who kind of could and was going to be in the business for a long time did want to become a worker owner. She secured financing for 70% of the business, took out a loan. The business took out a loan to essentially purchase itself, 70%, and the remainder was employee buy-in and her taking on a seller note for that 30%. So I'm going to talk now a little bit more generally about the process that she went through and what we do with workers. Let me double check before I go into this new section if there's any questions. Okay. So we have a 5-step process for working with business owners of all types. This isn't just in childcare. And kind of going back to the need for confidentiality, the first 2 steps of our process are just working with the owners. And they're going to sound really familiar from kind of the exit planning slides that we were talking about earlier. We start out talking about timeline, people's personal financial needs, kind of what they're hoping for out of their business in terms of the legacy they want to leave behind and the financial return that they want to receive. And sometimes that's like one 45-minute meeting if people have been thinking about this for a long time. And sometimes that's a pretty intensive exit planning process that we go through. It really kind of depends on where people are when we first connect with them and start thinking specifically about employee ownership. The next phase is assessing the feasibility of the sale. Because we don't expect workers themselves to come in with a lot of capital, we have to make sure that the business can take on a loan to pay for itself and pay it back out of its own profits over time. So we're trying to find a purchase price that meets both the owner's expectations and goals and is going to be able to be paid off and is fair to the workers. And that's usually a pretty intensive process. A lot of times childcare business owners have a lot of their own personal finances wrapped up in their business. That's super common. And disentangling that, you know, we like to form really close relationships with the clients we work with on this, because it is a puzzle that's best worked on together. The other piece, and this is sort of related to what we talked about with Ms. Frislin, is the operational feasibility piece. So we do an inventory of the skills that the owner brings to the center, an inventory of the skills that staff have, and try and figure out whether it's a matter of hiring a new director, hiring a bookkeeper. Are there people in the center already who can kind of step up into more leadership roles, and create what we think is sort of the most operational plan. And this all happens typically before we have the first meeting with employees. We've sort of settled on a financial package that meets the owner's needs, that we think we can get bank financing for, that we think the business can continue to be stable and generate profits for its employees. And we have a management succession plan in place, typically before we sit down and have that first meeting with employees. So in stage 3, we're really presenting those plans to workers, often introducing the concept of a co-op for the first time, and then asking if there's enough interest from that group for some of them to become a steering committee and want to work through the nuts and bolts of what this really would specifically look like from them. And kind of going back to when I was talking about, there's 3 pillars, like big ideas that have to be in a worker co-op, and then there's a lot of flexibility in what that can look like and how it can meet the specific needs of workers. We typically come in with a proposal just to limit the meeting time, what we think makes sense. We try and explain why we think that makes sense and, you know, give a sense of the options so that people can push back if there are things that need to be different. So for example, one of our proposals is that after a year of working at the center, people are eligible for a membership, can be a worker owner, can be a member of the business. And for some of the businesses we work with, because of histories of turnover, different things that happen in the center, they really want it to be 2 years or 3 years, and that's fine. It's just a longer sort of tenure track period where people aren't yet eligible to be members, but are brought into a little bit of an understanding of what it means to be a member, some of the training that helps people be effective worker owners. We're also confirming the plan for management transitions, making sure kind of the people that the owner identified as potentially wanting to step up into leadership roles actually want to step up into those leadership roles. And we're talking about the financial transaction so that people understand what they are buying into and what they can expect to see in return, the projections for the business going forward. And typically, to do that, we provide some, you know, financial training. Sometimes people have never seen a balance sheet or a profit and loss sheet before. And our approach is that, you know, everyone can learn that at the level that they need to know it to be an effective worker owner and make those decisions together. So that's a big part of what we offer, is some of that training component for the workers as well. So I wanted to provide a little bit of a deep dive into what these financing transactions actually look like. So part of buying into being an owner, you do, you know, pay some amount of money. We have skin in the game to be an owner in the business. But we really work with that steering committee of workers to figure out the right price that feels meaningful but not prohibitive. So we don't want anyone who really wants to be an owner to not be able to afford it. And we are able to often get separate loans for that period of employee contribution, so that if employees can't pay the $200 or $1,000 necessary to become a worker owner up front, they can do so through payroll deductions over time. So we really don't want anyone to be locked out of ownership because of finances, and that's a really big part of what we do. So in this case, in this kind of just example childcare business, 10 employees put in $500 and contributed $5,000, or like generally a pretty small portion of the purchase price of this business, but this is typical of what we're setting up. The owner deferred payment for $40,000 of the purchase price. So that owner is going to receive that $40,000 over time and with interest, usually kind of in parallel to the bank. So, anywhere from 5 to 10 years, they're going to be receiving monthly payments, typically monthly, sometimes annual payments. And then for $75,000, a bank loan, the co-op took on a bank loan to be able to pay the owner $75,000 to purchase that owner out of the business. So the total purchase price is $120,000. The owner walks away from kind of the purchase with $80,000, $5,000 from the workers, and $75,000 from the bank. So that's how the financing comes together, and both Matt and I can talk about the different banks and resources available to from organizations that are specifically focused on facilitating these sort of transactions. Matt, do you want to jump in and just talk about some of the Vermont-specific organizations that people should know about?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think one of the things that sometimes can differentiate an employee ownership transaction like this from a say sale to manager is that there are these kind of mission-aligned sources of capital that can help make it easier. And one thing in particular is, and that can be both challenging, but also that those kind of friendly capital providers are aware of, is personal guarantees. So oftentimes in the employee group, if you've got 10 employees, some might have significant amount of wealth, some might have very little wealth personally. So if they're all equally asked to guarantee the loan in the same way that, say, a sole proprietor might guarantee their loan or line of credit, it can cause a bunch of kind of issues, both around equity amongst the different people who are guaranteeing, but also the questions around okay, if someone leaves, do we need to leaves ownership and leaves the co-op? Do we need to refigure those things out? So a lot of the more specialized lenders are aware of this issue and don't require personal guarantees, which can be pretty substantial. In terms of loan capital, the Cooperative Fund of New England is a major player in our region. They're very familiar with these kinds of deals. They can lend, I think, usually up to $1 million, in the right kind of deal in terms of scale. And they, so they're oftentimes the first folks that we'll talk to when we get to this point in the transition process. The other, one of the other resources that's unique to Vermont, but that's actually there's a lot of interest from them in these kinds of deals, especially around things that they see as impactful in Vermont communities, and childcare definitely is one of them, is we're one of a handful of states that allow state chartered credit unions to make equity investments in other cooperatives. And the Vermont State Employees Credit Union, or VSECU, has a co-op capital fund that will make what essentially is like non-voting, very patient equity investments in other co-ops, including worker cooperatives. And so they have, if there's kind of that sense of, okay, then the employees need to bring a little more equity to the table in order to entice some of that debt, they are a real powerful potential partner in terms of these sorts of scale of deals. And then the two other things I'll point out is, one is just the Vermont Community Loan Fund has, as many of you I think have interacted with them in terms of lending and things like that. So they certainly have a strong interest in childcare and have expressed interest in participating more in succession type financing. And then our organization, the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, has two things I want to tag. One is we have a revolving loan fund where we oftentimes will kind of tag on to something like the Cooperative Fund of New England that can do up to sort of $50,000 in subordinated loans or debt. And the other thing that we're actually working on right now, and I'm about to submit a grant application for a pilot on it, is a employee matching equity fund. So that $5,000 that the employees put in, there's a lot of loan funds around Vermont that are nonprofit, mission driven. But as we've kind of talked around and looked around the world, there's not a lot of that. There's not a lot of opportunities for that more patient equity. And so the idea with this, and as we're aiming to launch it, is that it would basically say, okay, whatever the employees can put in, it will match that with a very patient, low return thing that can be eventually paid off over time, but really aims to kind of amplify the impact of the employee contribution to the deal. So that's kind of in process that we're setting up right now, and will hopefully be an additional resource that will be available in the coming months. So that's kind of a very quick overview of the sort of Vermont specific financing resources and regional that are available to help make these sorts of things happen.
Great. Yeah, it's great to hear about the investment going on throughout Vermont in this. It's really exciting. Okay. So let me just quickly double check the questions. All right, let's take a look at there. We move on. This is step 4 of the transition process, although often, we say many of these things should kind of start happening as soon as they can. So engaging your licensing rep, engaging your landlord, kind of as soon as you're confident that this is going to move forward and you feel ready to kind of break that confidentiality, you want to start to talk to these folks and make sure that everything can transition smoothly. The biggest thing we're trying to avoid, and this is true of all sales, is gaps in your ability to provide childcare service, which of course damages children and families, damages the value of the business and the success of the person taking over the business. So playing a role in facilitating that is something that we do often look to owners to do, and is just really important regardless of the exit plan that you choose. And then we're drawing up the papers to actually transition the business and finalize and close on the financing. Exactly what the license transfer process looks like varies state to state, and I'm not an expert in Vermont license transfer. But typically someone going to the training that an owner would have to go to. Often it's the director who steps into that role. And that's a question that your licensing rep can work with you on to figure out exactly what that's going to look like. So kind of right before you close is the time to tell families and community stakeholders that this is happening. And we really think that this is a moment to celebrate. There's a lot of benefits to families that this business that they've trusted to care for their child is going to continue on with the same staff that they've come to know and love. It really anchors that business in the community, and we think a lot of folks are excited. And it's a marketing element too, that the person who's caring for your child also has an ownership stake in the business, and that level of commitment. And then we work with businesses on a longer term, oftentimes to build skills that just help you be a better worker owner. So deeper understanding of the financials of the business, how to run an effective meeting, conflict resolution, just all of the things that really, lots of childcare staff can benefit from, but is particularly important in an employee-owned center as part of an ongoing learning process for cooperative businesses. I think, if you have any questions or you're interested in learning more, we have a lot of resources on our website. Just a general exit planning guide that walks through some of the information I shared at the beginning of this presentation, a deeper dive into valuation for childcare businesses, which is not something I really talked about here, but can answer some questions on, as well as more information on worker ownership. It's all available on our website. I think we'll make these resources available to you in other ways as well. I'm also going to be sharing a Calendly link to schedule consultations if people want to schedule 30 minutes of time with me to talk about your specific businesses offline or offline from this. It will still be online, unfortunately. You'll have an opportunity to do that as well. So thank you so much for your time today. I think that's just about an hour. And now we have some time for questions.
So I'll throw out one other thing in terms of the ability, or kind of two things from your presentation, and one thing that's just kind of coming up is that for folks who are also kind of interested in getting a deeper dive into this model, the Vermont Employee Ownership Center puts on a conference every year. And this year, again, doing it online because it's this time, but it kind of works through both kind of some more of the mechanics, specific mechanics of the process, and talking about some of the financing and employee engagement stuff in deeper ways. And so if you're interested in attending that, we'll certainly provide LuAnn with a discount code that can be sent out, and it's August 18th. The other thing on the financing, and Anne mentioned sort of parents, and I think there's some interesting possibilities as well around, in terms of kind of those sources of friendly financing. There are some Vermont co-ops that have, and in Massachusetts and other places as well, that beyond going to institutional sources of financing have kind of gone to community supporters for very kind of like friendly sources. So two examples I can kind of point to of that is, one locally is there's a PT360, which is a physical therapy cooperative that now has 3 locations and 30-some employees. It was founded by a group of 12 women who had all worked together and other places at one time or another, and decided they all wanted to form their own practice together. And so they kind of went out and they're like, okay, we need to build a facility and fit it out and all of that. They went out to sort of the broader friends and family network and were able to raise some of this, again, non-voting equity that they paid like a 5% dividend on or something like that. That was able to really help limit the amount of outside debt they needed to have and have kind of some patient supporters with that. The other example I would point to is there's a organ that's more kind of going to the public. It's an organization called Real Pickles down in Massachusetts, which is kind of one of the case studies of, they had some very loyal customers. They went out to the customer base and said like, hey, would you invest in us to convert to a co-op and expand our facility and all of that? And they were able to raise enough kind of from those patient investors to do so. And I do think that there's some really interesting opportunities with potentially raising some of that money from parents in this case. That could be sort of patient low interest loans, or that similarly that form of kind of voting equity. That could, as you sort of design design a deal like this, that the story of selling to the employees could be quite compelling. And I've certainly even known, I had someone reach out to me a few months ago about who was a parent in a child care center and had kind of heard something around some issues with the real estate that they had heard from the owner, and was actually kind of like seriously considering the idea of proposing, like, would it make sense for the parents to essentially come together and sort of like buy the building or do something like that to help secure the future of this center, because it was very important to their family. And so I think that there's a lot of possibilities there, kind of as depending on the center, as you kind of go down and explore this route. So that was just one other thing as I was listening that I figured I'd throw out there as a reaction. But LuAnn, similarly, do you have any kind of reactions or thoughts or reflections?
There's so much great information in this, and so much of what you've talked about, Anne, really answers some questions that I've heard from owners of childcare businesses across the state. It does dawn on me that this is a confidential sort of conversation that you're having, that these owners are thinking about this, are not, as you talked about, the idea around being public about questions or concerns or gathering more information might be a little bit sensitive. So I do want to urge people. Anne has been great, nice enough to offer these 30-minute in-person but not in-person consultations. I urge folks to take her up on that. I think that what an opportunity that is. Some of the information around transfer that Anne referenced early on that she didn't go deeply into because we did it last week on the other professional development opportunity that we did with Lynn Silva and Heather from Vermont Community Loan Fund. The recording of that, along with the recording from this and other resources, will be a toolkit on the Shared Services website. So anything that you've missed or want to revisit, we'll make sure that you have access to it there. And we will send out this recording to you folks who have participated as soon as it's uploaded and ready to go. So we want to make sure you have this information. I know it takes some time to think about some of this, and more questions will come up as you think about it. And Matt and his team are so helpful. I'm happy to answer questions or give you connections to folks who can answer a question if I don't have the information. And let's take Ann up on her offering to give you some in-person kind of individual guidance or answers to questions around this. So we at Let's Grow Kids are, as you know, those of you who are on this, are invested in capacity building around childcare issues in Vermont and making sure that the current programs are able to exist in offering high quality services now as you folks are running them, and then as you look toward the future. So we want to help with this, and really appreciate folks taking the time to think about this option as you think about your transition.
Great. So yeah, now would be the time if there are any audience questions or things that would be worthwhile to have clarification or you're curious about. We can you can either send them in via the chat or the Q&A function, or if you'd like to sort of ask the question directly, just use the little raise your hand, and then I can add you to the mix. But we'll just kind of give it a moment here to see if anyone has any specific things that came out of this that you wanted us to dig into any further.
While we wait for any questions that come in, I just wanted to piggyback on what you were saying earlier, Matt. The one thing we do talk to clients and folks about is multi-stakeholder co-op. So a combination of a parent co-op, which I think is something that people might be more familiar with, a nonprofit that's governed by parents, is a model that's existed across the U.S. for a long time. With the worker co-op, which we think is really an important piece of it. We want workers to stay with the business for a long time, and we want workers to have higher wages, and those are some of the things we think a worker co-op can provide. But there are ways to kind of blend the two that are really interesting and exciting, especially if you have a lot of community engagement around the services you provide.
That resonates with me. I am a product of the 1970s parent co-ops. That is where I started in the world of childcare. So so much of what you talk about is related, and I can see how they could connect, and yet there are differences, obviously. So yeah, that's been on my mind as I've been thinking about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that. I think one of the key things that's really powerful about the employee ownership model is the kind of empowerment and retention piece, right? Where people might be able to look at a job that otherwise was maybe a stepping stone or a gig and think, oh, well, there's more of a future here than there might not otherwise have been. And so we do, as you mentioned, definitely see in a lot of organizations, businesses across the spectrum, the sort of like improved turnover rates. We do have a question here from Annette. Our school used to be a parent co-op, now is a nonprofit organization. We would transition from that to workers co-op. Can you speak to what that could look like?
Yeah, that's exciting to know that you're thinking about these things. I think transitioning from a nonprofit to a for-profit is possible but challenging. But there are absolutely ways to think about how to include employee voices in your governance structure. So having seats on the board that are reserved for employees to vote on who occupies those seats, whether they're employees themselves on the board or outside stakeholders who are explaining sort of their positions and approaches to workers, and then workers vote on them. there's a lot of ways to incorporate more what we would call kind of worker governance into a nonprofit center. And I can absolutely talk to you more about that. It looks a little bit different than a for-profit co-op, but in a lot of ways, you know, it's really about building that same culture and investment, and you can absolutely do that within nonprofit structure as well.
So one thing that we also occasionally get at the Vermont Employee Ownership Center is situations where a nonprofit owns essentially an operating business and are exploring the idea of, okay, should we sell or spin off the business and then, you know, take the proceeds and focus on our mission? And so definitely one thing I've been curious about, and I would be curious, Anne, if you're aware of any examples of essentially something like that doing it, where you could have like a nonprofit center that sells the business as an asset to the employees, and then kind of uses the proceeds essentially to provide scholarships or other things like that to sort of, you know, having that mission, you know, the nonprofit mission being, you know, supporting access to childcare. Have you ever seen sort of like anyone exploring a route like that?
I wish I could say yes. I haven't. But I think that it's a great idea. And I think that especially for community organizations that might provide childcare as just part of their mission, you know, sometimes that can be a tricky thing to accomplish, and it could make a lot of sense as a way to move forward with a worker cooperative in that case.
All right. Any other questions or considerations you'd like us to dig into, folks?
And Matt, I would just add that I will send out the link to the video and then request that anyone who has feedback or questions to send them on to me. And if they're for Anne or Matt or any other resources that we might be connected to, I will link you there. And the information regarding your professional development will go to Northern Lights sometime within the next week or so. So you will get credit for this amount of time through the professional development system. And yeah, I think this was a lot of great information, and I'm anxious to see what comes of it. So Anne, how will the link to your availability go out? Is that something I will send along with the video?
Is that the easiest way to do it? It seems like it could be. I could certainly just send there'll be a Calendly link to my schedule.
Yeah, if that works for you, that would work really well. I can get it out to everyone who's on the call.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for doing that.
Great. So let's last call for questions, and then I'll stop the recording here. All right, so I will stop the recording. So thank you all for